There's a moment in Season 2, Episode 12, Better Angels, that most people remember for the wrong reason. They remember the field. They remember Rick's hand on the knife. But here's what I keep coming back to. Earlier in that same episode, Shane is doing a routine supply check. Methodical. Careful. Quietly efficient. Doing exactly what a good survivor does. And then a few scenes later, he's gone. Rick said it to Laurie just before the end. He's not going to change. He can't. But watching that supply check, Shane looked like someone who already had, or someone who never needed to. His final expression wasn't rage. It was recognition. Like he understood exactly what was about to happen, and maybe even understood why. So here's the quiet question this whole theory rests on. Was Shane removed because he was wrong, or because he was already dangerously close to being right? Here's a question that doesn't get asked enough. Not about the walkers, not about the communities, not about who's going to survive the next season, but about a choice made in a grassy field in Georgia sometime in Season 2, and what that choice quietly cost the story for the next decade. Shane Walsh died in Season 2, Episode 12, Better Angels. Rick Grimes stabbed him. Carl shot the reanimated body. And the show moved on almost immediately. New threats, new alliances, new losses. The grief was brief. The processing was minimal. And maybe that brevity was the first clue that something unusual had happened narratively, something the show wasn't quite ready to examine out loud. Because here's the thing about Shane. He wasn't a side character. He wasn't a peripheral figure who drifted in and out of the story. Before the outbreak, he was Rick's closest friend, his partner at the King County Sheriff's Department, the person who ran into that hospital under fire and genuinely believed he couldn't get Rick out safely. He carried that guilt the whole time he was keeping Laurie and Carl alive, months of it. Then Rick came back, and Shane had to rearrange his entire understanding of who he was and what his place in this world meant. That's not a villain arc. That's a tragedy. And yet the show made a choice, a deliberate, structurally important choice, to remove Shane from the story at the exact moment his worldview was beginning to make undeniable sense. Not moral sense, not kind sense, but practical, observable, survival-tested sense. The theory I want to walk through tonight is this. Shane Walsh wasn't written out because he was too dangerous to the group. He was written out because he was too revealing to the story, specifically too revealing about Rick, about where Rick was going, about what Rick was quietly becoming. There's a pattern in The Walking Dead that becomes visible once you start looking for it. And it's not subtle once you've seen it. The show has a habit of removing characters who make the protagonist's future choices legible too early. Characters who hold up a mirror and show the hero a version of themselves they aren't ready to acknowledge. Dale Horvath is the clearest earlier example of this. Dale died in Season 2, Episode 11. Judge, jury, executioner. Just one episode before Shane. And Dale's death wasn't accidental in its placement. Dale was the group's moral voice. He was the one arguing loudest and executing a prisoner, holding on to civilization's ethics in an uncivilized world still mattered. When Dale died, that argument died with him. And then, almost immediately, the show killed Shane. 2 episodes, 2 characters. One was the moral framework. One was the mirror showing Rick the frame he was already growing into. That timing doesn't feel accidental. It feels structural. What makes Shane's removal especially resonant is the emotional architecture of what it cost. This was the first time Rick killed someone he genuinely loved. Not someone threatening strangers. Not a walker. Not a distant enemy. His best friend. The man who had been a surrogate father to his son while Rick was in a coma. And Rick did it not in a moment of desperate, reactive self-defense. He walked toward it. He initiated the confrontation. He made a choice. We'll come back to that choice and what it reveals. But for now, let me just sit with the emotional weight of it for a moment, because that's the part the theory actually hangs on. Not the stabbing, not the field. Not even Carl's shot ringing out in the dark. It's the fact that after Shane died, Rick essentially picked up Shane's worldview and carried it forward, without ever calling it that, without ever grieving what it meant that he'd become capable of making exactly the kind of calculation Shane had been making all along. He just started doing it, and the show let him, because Shane was gone, and there was no mirror left to show Rick what it looked like. That's where I want to start. With the question nobody asked in that field, and the decade of storytelling it quietly shaped. Before we get into what Shane's removal meant structurally, I think it's worth spending some real time with who Shane Walsh actually was, because the show's framing of him as the jealous, volatile antagonist to Rick's principled heroism is accurate on the surface and deeply incomplete underneath. Start at the beginning. When the outbreak happened, Rick was in a coma. Shane, his partner, his friend, went to that hospital, under chaos, under gunfire, under the kind of disorder that breaks people before it even asks them what they're made of. He tried to get Rick out. He dragged a hospital bed in front of the room door to buy time. He genuinely believed Rick was dead when he left. That's not abandonment. That's a man making a triage decision in the worst possible moment. The kind of decision the show would later frame as reasonable or even heroic when other characters made it. Then, for however many months before Rick showed up again, and the timeline is a little flexible in canon, but it's at least several months, Shane kept Laurie and Carl alive. He built a relationship with Laurie out of grief and genuine care, under the belief that Rick was gone. He became a father figure to Carl. He organised and protected the Atlanta survivor camp. He led, and then Rick came back. What the show gives us in Season 1 and Season 2 is a man trying to reconcile his genuine love for his best friend with the fact that his best friend's return has structurally erased the life Shane had built in the aftermath. That's not a moustache-twirling villain setup. That's a human being caught in an impossible situation, slowly choosing survival over sentiment. Shane's philosophy, stated with quiet consistency across both seasons, comes down to something he says with real conviction: that the world is what it is now, and protecting their own is the only thing that matters. It's not a philosophy of cruelty, it's a philosophy of clarity. He's not indifferent to suffering. He's decided that acknowledging suffering can't come at the expense of preventing more of it. That distinction matters, because when Shane killed Otis, back in Season 2, Episode 3, saved the last one, it read as monstrous in the moment. He shot the man who had come with him on a supply run to get medical equipment for Carl, shot him in the leg, left him for the walkers to slow them down, and came back with the supplies that saved Carl's life. It's a brutal sequence. Shane's shaved head in the next scene, the visual signal of something psychologically shared, tells you the show understood the cost. But here's what the theory asks us to sit with. Carl lived. The supplies arrived in time. The mission succeeded. Shane sacrificed one person to save another, and the arithmetic came out in the group's favour. The show frames this as the moment Shane crossed a line. And maybe it was, but it was also, in its cold logic, exactly the kind of calculation the show would later make look difficult but necessary when Rick did something similar. When Rick chose to execute Thomas in Season 3. When Rick bit out Joe's throat on the road in Season 4 to protect Carl. When Rick used the Alexandria community's safety to justify extraordinary violence again and again. None of those moments got the head-shaving scene. None of them were filmed with the same horror movie grammar the show used on Shane. They got filmed as dark but necessary, cost but justified, hard but understandable. The motif that runs through this, quietly across seasons, is the sheriff's hat. Shane wore it, Rick wore it, and then Carl wore it. The hat begins as a symbol of order, of the old world's authority carried forward. On Shane, it already fits him perfectly. He's doing the work of survival, but the framing suggests he's wearing authority he shouldn't have claimed. On Rick, it becomes a symbol of leadership earned through suffering. On Carl, it becomes something more complicated, the inheritance of both men's choices, carried forward on a child's head. The hat doesn't judge, but it remembers. And tonight that memory is going to trace a very long line. There's a narrative device The Walking Dead uses so consistently, it becomes almost invisible after a while. And it's the device that, I think, explains most clearly why Shane had to go when he did. The show removes characters when their continued presence would force the protagonist to make an internal choice too early. When their existence as a mirror becomes more narratively costly than their existence as a person. Think about it this way. Laurie Grimes is often discussed as a source of dramatic friction between Rick and Shane. And she is, on the surface. The love triangle element is real, and it matters. But look at what Laurie's conversations with Rick actually do in Season 2, and you'll notice something quieter underneath the romantic tension. Laurie, in her own conflicted, complicated way, keeps telling Rick that Shane is dangerous, that he needs to be dealt with. There's a conversation in Season 2, Episode 11, just before Dale's death, where Laurie essentially gives Rick permission to do what she believes needs to be done about Shane. She doesn't say it directly, she wraps it in concern, in fear, in the language of protection. But the implication is there and Rick hears it. Here's where the story structure gets interesting. Robert Kirkman, who created the Walking Dead comics and was deeply involved in the show's development, confirmed across multiple interviews that Shane's arc in the source material was designed to show Rick crossing a threshold. That killing Shane was meant to mark the moment Rick became capable of the harder, darker choices the story would require of him. The show inherited that intention and then complicated it across years of additional storytelling. Because if Shane's death was supposed to mark Rick's crossing of a moral threshold, then everything Rick does after that point is downstream of Shane. Every execution, every violent calculation, every moment where Rick chooses the group's safety over an individual's mercy. That's Shane's logic running through Rick's hands. The uncomfortable parallel the show never quite names is this: Negan's operating philosophy. The idea that people are resources to be managed, that the strong protects the many through force, is philosophically almost identical to what Shane had been arguing throughout Season 2. Not word for word, and the show never draws that line explicitly. But structurally, the logic is the same. People have value as long as they contribute. The strong protect the group by any means necessary. Sentiment is a liability that survival cannot afford. Shane said this with an earnest, frustrated urgency. The urgency of a man who genuinely believed it was true and couldn't understand why the people around him refused to see it. Negan said it with theatre and barbed wire and a carefully constructed mythology of dominance. But the underlying argument, Shane was there first, and that's the showrunner pattern worth paying attention to. When the franchise wants to explore a philosophical position, usually a dark, utilitarian, survival-first position, it doesn't return to Shane. It creates a new character, a new rapper, a new face with new aesthetic energy. The Governor, Gareth, Dawn Lerner, Negan, Alpha, Lance Hornsby, the CRM. Each of them is carrying some version of Shane's argument, repackaged, recontextualized, and represented as a fresh threat. The show keeps asking Shane's question without ever saying his name again. Why? My best guess, ma'am, and I want to be clear, this is interpretation, not confirmed by the writers, is that Shane's removal allowed the show to keep the question open. As long as Shane was alive, the philosophical debate had a human face that the audience could root for or against. Once he was gone, the argument itself became the antagonist. And an argument is harder to kill than a person, which is exactly why it's still alive, season after season, spin-off after spin-off, in every group that decides the math of survival justifies any cost. It's where the story begins to carry the weight of that field in Georgia, not as a memory anyone names, but as a gravitational pull no character fully escapes. And it starts with one question: what would have happened if Rick had walked away from that confrontation instead of into it? That's where the evidence starts to get interesting. One of the quieter gifts Shane Walsh gave the story, completely unintentionally from his position as a dead man, is a track record that the show keeps validating episode after episode, long after anyone stops saying his name. Shane's predictions, laid out across Season 1 and Season 2, have a striking accuracy rate for a character framed as the villain of the early story. The farm. Shane argued from almost the moment the group arrived at Herschel's property that it was unsustainable, that the fences wouldn't hold, that the illusion of normalcy was dangerous, more dangerous in fact than the honest acknowledgement of how precarious their situation was. He wasn't wrong about the emotional seduction of the place. The group sank into it. They started having arguments about Glenn and Maggie's relationship, about Laurie's pregnancy, about the morality of what to do with a prisoner in the barn, normal people problems. And Shane kept watching the tree line, watching the perimeter, watching the walkers build up against the fence and saying, this is borrowed time. Season 2's finale, beside the dying fire, proved him right in spectacular, devastating fashion. The farm fell. The herd came through the muff fence, overran the property, scattered the group into the dark. Everything Shane had quietly warned about arrived at once. He wasn't alive to see it. But his analysis was, the prison is the next one. And this requires a little more nuance because Shane never specifically advocated for or against the prison. He was already dead when the group founded in Season 3. But here's the interesting echo. Everything Shane argued about the farm applies directly to what the prison became. The belief that a fortified location could become a permanent home, the settling in, the gradual reconstruction of community norms, the vulnerability of leadership disagreement. In this case, Rick's fragile mental state and the governor's methodical siege. The prison fell in the Season 4 mid-season finale. Too far gone, in exactly the way Shane would have predicted any fixed community would fall. Slowly, then all at once, under the pressure of someone willing to make harder choices than its defenders. The pattern here is worth naming because it's a deliberate storytelling habit across the franchise. The Walking Dead consistently vindicates dead characters' strategic warnings retroactively. It's not unique to Shane. Herschel argued that the group needed to maintain their humanity, and that argument gets validated through the Commonwealth arc years later. Dale argued that civilization's ethics were worth protecting, and versions of that argument keep reappearing in characters like Aaron and Father Gabriel. But Shane's vindication is the most consistent, and arguably the most significant, because it keeps arriving in the shape of catastrophe rather than wisdom. Which raises a question I find genuinely compelling. If Shane's tactical instincts were this accurate, and they were repeatedly, what does it say about the story's handling of his moral instincts? Was the show separating Shane's correctness about survival from Shane's wrongness about humanity? Is that distinction coherent? Can you be right about how the world works and wrong about how to live in it at the same time? I think that's exactly the tension the show is chasing, and I think it never quite resolved it. Because every time the franchise raises Shane's argument through a new character, the show has to answer the same question again. Is this person's logic actually wrong, or is it just ugly? The governor thought he was protecting Woodbury. Gareth thought Terminus was an efficient solution to scarcity. Negan thought the saviours were keeping the region alive. Each of them had a survival argument that wasn't entirely irrational, wrapped in a cruelty that made it easier to dismiss. But Shane didn't have the cruelty wrapper, not at first. He had genuine care and a pragmatic worldview, and the show had to remove him before that combination became too sympathetic to manage. That's not a criticism of the story. It's an observation about how careful the storytelling had to be. Shane's argument, unfiltered, in the mouth of a man we genuinely liked, was too destabilising to let breathe past season 2. So the franchise distributed it across villains, across institutions, across the CRM's entire ideology. And that's where the evidence trail starts getting genuinely interesting. Let me bring you back to that scene in season 2, episode 3. Save the last one, because it's the moment everything about Shane crystallises, and I don't think it gets examined carefully enough. Shane and Otis went to the high school together to get medical supplies for Carl. It was a near impossible run from the start. The school was overrun, the supplies were in a specific location, and getting out required moving through hundreds of walkers with limited ammunition and no backup. They made it inside, they got the supplies, and then they couldn't make it out. What Shane did next, shooting Otis in the leg and leaving him as a distraction, was filmed with deliberate horror movie texture. The dim light, the narrow corridor, Otis falling, Shane limping away with the bag that would save Carl's life. It's shot to be felt as a betrayal, and it is a betrayal. In the most straightforward sense, Shane killed an innocent man to survive and to keep his mission intact. But here's the layer underneath that the scene asks you to sit with, if you're willing. Otis volunteered for this run partially as penance. He was the one who accidentally shot Carl in the first place. He understood, on some level, that the run was necessary because of him, and when Shane made the calculation, one life for one life, and the life being saved was a child, the arithmetic, in its cold brutality, resolved in the group's favour. Carl lived. The supplies arrived. The mission succeeded. The show, to its credit, doesn't let Shane off the hook emotionally. He comes back to the farm and sits with Laurie and Patricia, Otis's grieving partner, and tells a lie about how Otis died bravely, that he covered their retreat so Shane could get through. Shane sits through Otis's memorial holding that lie in his body. And then alone he shaves his head. It's one of the most psychologically specific visual choices the show makes in its early seasons. The hair removal's grief and armour simultaneously. Something is being shed. Something else is calcifying in its place. It's the show's way of marking a transformation that the character can't verbalise. Shane isn't the kind of man who processes in words. He processes in action, in silence, in the altered shape of his own reflection. What I find striking, in the context of the larger theory, is how Rick's own transformations are tracked physically in almost identical ways. Rick's beard is the most obvious example. It grows in during periods of retreat and isolation, gets shaved or trimmed when Rick is claiming a new identity or asserting a new kind of control. In season 3, returning to King County, he's haunted and scruffy. In the Alexandria period, he's cleaned up and trying to be normal. In the later seasons, the beard becomes almost a mood indicator for Rick's relationship to his own darkness. Shane and Rick share this physical language of transformation, the body marking what the psyche won't name. It's the show establishing, early, that these two men process identity the same way. Which makes Shane, in retrospect, less an antagonist and more a preview. There's also the question of what Otis's death does to the community's moral atmosphere. Otis was one of the people most committed to maintaining some version of the old world's ethics. Religious, careful, genuinely remorseful about the accident that hurt Carl. He was, in a quiet way, doing the same work Dale was doing, representing the part of the group that believed how you treated people still mattered. Shane removed that voice, and then Dale's death removed the last version of it, all within the same season. The group that entered Season 3 had been systematically stripped of its most insistent moral voices, and then it found a prison and a leader who was starting to speak Shane's language without knowing it. The gesture of that shaved head, the silence of Otis's memorial, where everyone believed the lie, the sheriff's hat sitting on the dresser back in the farmhouse, 3 anchors for one moment, all of them pointing in the same quiet direction. Something ended at that high school, and something new started wearing its face. The specifics of how Shane died matter more than the story usually acknowledges, not the emotional arc. That's been discussed, catalogued, analysed extensively. But the mechanics, the choices Rick made in the minutes before and during that confrontation. Because if you watch Season 2, Episode 12 carefully, there's a detail in the sequence that changes what the death means. Rick didn't end up in that field because Shane forced him there. Rick walked Shane out there. Shane had stolen Randall, the prisoner the group had been debating whether to execute, and killed him, staging the scene to look like Randall had escaped and attacked him. The plan, as it becomes clear, was to lure Rick away from the group and deal with what Shane had decided Rick represented, a dangerous liability whose compassion kept exposing everyone to unnecessary risk. Shane had made his calculation. Rick's morality was the problem. But here's the beat that doesn't get enough attention. Rick knew. He figured out what Shane had done, what Randall's actual cause of death was, and he walked Shane out there anyway. He knew where the confrontation was heading, and he moved toward it deliberately. In the field, Rick offers Shane the gun, handle first. It's framed as a gesture of trust or submission. Look, I'm not a threat, but Shane, who knows Rick better than almost anyone, doesn't buy it. Because it's not a gesture of trust, it's a test, and it's also an invitation. When Rick stabs Shane, he does it while Shane is momentarily distracted by the extended hand. It's a tactical move, precise, deliberate, committed. Not reactive panic, not desperate self-defense in its most instinctive form. Rick chose to end Shane. The line Rick delivers to the group afterward, essentially that Shane came at him, that he had no choice, is technically accurate in the sense that Shane initiated the confrontation, but it elides the geometry of what actually happened. Rick walked into that geometry with full awareness of where it was going. Laurie's role in this is worth sitting with. In Season 2, Episode 11, Laurie has a private conversation with Rick about Shane, about how she believes he's dangerous, about what she fears he might do. She doesn't say the words directly. She says something more ambiguous, closer to, I understand if something has to happen. It's the kind of statement that does quiet work, giving Rick implicit permission to make a decision she doesn't want to name out loud. Some fans read Laurie's role as manipulative, as engineering Shane's death through Rick's hands. I don't think it's that clean. Laurie was genuinely frightened. She was also protecting her family. But the structural effect is the same either way. The conversation gave Rick moral cover before the confrontation happened. What the theory wants to notice here is not culpability. It's psychological architecture. Rick needed to own Shane's death. Not as a trauma visited on him, not as a defensive killing he was pushed into, but as a choice he made. Because if it was a choice, if Rick decided, then everything downstream of it is also Rick's decision. The trajectory starts there, and Rick, I think the story is quietly suggesting, understood that. The man who walked Shane into that field was beginning the process of becoming the man who would run the prison by force, who would return to King County and find Morgan descended into grief madness in Season 3, Episode 12, Clear, who would bite out a man's throat on the road to protect his son in season 4. He was taking ownership of a version of himself that Shane had been living openly for months. The gesture, Rick's hand extended with the gun, handle first. The silence, the moment Shane sees what's about to happen and recognises it. The symbol, the knife already in Rick's other hand, held at his side. 3 anchors for 1 death. And the death isn't an ending. It's a transfer of something too large to name in a field in the dark. Here's where the pattern becomes undeniable if you're willing to track it season by season. After Shane's death, Rick Grimes does not mourn. Not publicly. Not in any sustained way. Not in the manner of a man who has just killed his closest friend. There's a brief fragmentation. Rick telling the group that night in season 2, episode 12, that the group isn't a democracy anymore. This isn't a democracy anymore. It's delivered with barely contained grief and freshly earned darkness. And then the show moves forward and Rick moves with it. What follows, tracked closely, is Rick executing Shane's philosophy with increasing fluency across seasons. In season 3, episode 2, Sick, Rick meets Thomas, one of the surviving prisoners left inside the prison, when the group begins clearing it. Thomas is erratic, dangerous, a threat to the group's control of the facility. Rick watches him carefully. And when Thomas makes a move, swinging his machete in a way that could have been aimed at a walker or could have been aimed at Rick, Rick buries a machete in Thomas's skull immediately, without debate, without deliberation. He then leaves the other prisoner, Andrew, outside the fence where the walkers wait. A functional execution, efficiency, threat assessment, preemptive action. Shane would recognise every choice in that sequence. The King County episode is another one worth sitting with. Season 3, episode 12, Clear. Rick goes back to his hometown and finds Morgan, his very first connection in the New World, who has descended into a kind of grief madness, living in a booby-trap building surrounded by the cleared dead. Rick tries to pull Morgan back. Morgan can't come yet. The scene is devastating. 2 men who once represented hope for each other, meeting in the ruins of the old world, neither of them quite the person the other remembers. What strikes me about it, in the context of this theory, is what it shows about Rick's internal state in that season 3 stretch. He's hallucinating Laurie. He's barely holding the group together. He's making decision after decision from Shane's playbook. Control, force, pragmatism. And when he looks at Morgan, who's been alone with unprocessed grief and gone somewhere Rick hasn't fully gone yet, he seems to see something he can't quite name. A version of what loss looks like when it has nowhere to go. Carl's arc runs parallel to all of this, in a way the show handles beautifully. Carl shot reanimated Shane. That was the first time Carl killed someone, and the person he killed was someone who had functionally been his second father during Rick's coma. The show traces that weight forward. Carl becoming harder, more pragmatic, developing his own version of Shane's clarity about what survival requires. The sheriff's hat moves with this. Carl wears it through the prison years, and it sits on him differently than it sat on Rick or Shane. On Rick, it was authority. On Shane, it was aspiration. On Carl, it's inheritance. The hat carries both men forward through a child who loved them both and had to shoot one of them in a field. By the time we reach Daryl in the later seasons, the motif transforms again. Daryl never wears the hat. He's the character most resistant to the kind of leadership mythology the hat represents. But there's a detail in his behaviour across seasons. The way he deflects when people ask him to lead formally. The way he takes care of people in action rather than in symbol. The way he carries his grief physically in exhaustion and distance rather than in words. That reads as a man who has seen what leadership costs and is quietly, persistently afraid of paying that price. Daryl watched what happened to Rick. He watched what Rick became. And Daryl Dixon made a different kind of choice, season by season, about which parts of that example he was willing to follow. Shane's shadow falls across all of them, not as memory, as gravitational pull. And the show, meanwhile, has been quietly asking his question through every antagonist it creates. That's where the trail starts to take real shape. Let me step back from the main storyline for a moment and look at something that becomes clearer when you take a wide-angle view of the whole franchise. Shane Walsh was removed from the story in Season 2, but his argument, his specific philosophical position about survival, resources, and the cost of compassion, never left the Walking Dead universe. The franchise kept quoting him. It just changed the mouth doing the quoting. Start with Negan, because he's the most direct echo. Negan's entire ideological architecture across seasons 6 through 8 is built on a premise Shane stated plainly back in Season 2, that people have value as resources, that weakness is a liability the group cannot afford, and that a strong leader who makes hard choices is the only thing standing between a community and extinction. Negan has the charisma and theatre that Shane lacked, but the underlying logic is almost identical. When Negan explains the saviour system to Rick in Season 7, the tributes, the structure, the enforcement, he's essentially describing Shane's philosophy scaled up to institutional size with better branding. The show never draws this line directly. No character says Negan sounds like Shane. But the structural echo is there, and I think it's intentional. The franchise needed Shane's argument to keep living in the story, needed to keep asking whether pragmatic, force-based survival is morally coherent or morally bankrupt. Negan became the vehicle for that question, in a way that Shane, as Rick's grieving friend, could never quite be. Fear the Walking Dead offers another angle. Daniel Salazar, the former intelligence operative who surfaces across multiple seasons, runs on what is essentially Shane's operating logic. He makes brutal pragmatic choices. He compartmentalizes. He's capable of extraordinary violence in service of protecting the people he loves. And the show treats him with the same ambivalence it treated Shane. Not quite villain, not quite hero. A man whose methods are disturbing and whose results are difficult to argue with. The most ambitious extension of Shane's philosophy happens in The Walking Dead, World Beyond. Specifically in the Civic Republic military, the CRM. The CRM operates on a resource-based survival logic that would be philosophically familiar to Shane Walsh immediately. Communities are managed, resources are allocated strategically. Populations that don't contribute to the broader project of civilization survival are removed. It's Shane's field calculation. Who lives, who doesn't, what the math requires. Applied at the level of an entire political institution. Elizabeth Kublek, the CRM's representative in World Beyond, articulates the organisation's philosophy with a bureaucratic calm that makes it more unsettling, not less. She genuinely believes the CRM is humanity's best chance. The math, as she understands it, is brutal but correct. Sound familiar? What I find most compelling about this franchise-wide pattern is what it reveals about the show's central preoccupation. The Walking Dead isn't primarily a story about walkers. It's a story about what happens to human moral frameworks under existential pressure. About which values survive, which ones calcify into cruelty, and which ones quietly hollow out, even in people trying desperately to hold on to them. Shane was the first character to push the show's protagonist toward that question directly. And because the show wasn't ready to answer it in Season 2, because Rick wasn't ready to answer it, and because answering it too early would have collapsed the story's central tension, Shane had to go. His question, however, couldn't. It was too fundamental, too accurate, too alive. So the franchise redistributed it, gave it to the governor's fascist community management, gave it to Gareth's terrible utilitarian conclusion at Terminus, gave it to Negan's charismatic empire building, gave it to the CRM's cold institutional logic. Each version slightly more elaborated, slightly more contextualized, slightly further from the human face it wore in Season 2. But if you strip away the costumes, the barbed wire, the red scarves, the military uniforms, you keep finding the same argument underneath. The world is what it is. We protect our own. Everything else is sentiment the living cannot afford. Shane said it first, and the franchise has been arguing with his ghost ever since. That's where the pattern solidifies. That's where the theory starts to feel less like speculation and more like recognition. Here's the theory I want to lay out carefully, because I think it's more structural than it might first appear, and I want to be clear about what's interpretation and what's observable pattern. Shane Walsh was not removed from The Walking Dead because he became too villainous to sustain. He was removed because keeping him in the story would have resolved the show's central moral question too early. Let me build the case. The Walking Dead's core tension, the one that runs through every season, every spin-off, every community, every villain arc, is the conflict between two survival philosophies. Philosophy 1, maintain humanity, hold on to ethics, protect people as people. Philosophy 2, treat survival as the only operating value, make decisions based on resource logic, accept the emotional and moral cost as the price of keeping your people alive. Rick Grimes begins the story firmly committed to Philosophy 1. Shane Walsh, by Season 2, is operating almost entirely from Philosophy 2. The story needs that conflict to generate its moral drama. But, and this is the critical structural issue, if Shane stays alive and the conflict between them keeps escalating, the story is forced to resolve the question. Either Shane is definitively wrong and Rick defeats him, and everything Rick believes is validated, or Shane is definitively right, and the story collapses into something bleak with no moral centre. Either resolution kills the tension that powers the franchise. Shane's death is the solution to this problem. It removes the conflict without resolving it. The question survives its first spokesperson. What follows across the next decade of storytelling is the show's extended attempt to explore that question through a series of characters who each embody a different version of Shane's argument. The governor represents what happens when Shane's logic is applied by someone with genuine cruelty and ego investment. Gareth represents what happens when it becomes institutionalized into a community of survivors who arrived at their conclusion through their own specific trauma. Negan represents what happens when a charismatic leader turns it into theatre and ideology. The CRM represents what happens when it becomes the operating principle of a government. Each iteration allows the show to examine a different facet of the question Shane first raised, and Rick, and later Michonne, Daryl, Maggie, Carol, has to respond to each one without ever naming the original source. That's the showrunner habit I think is most worth identifying. The various Walking Dead writers' rooms have consistently used new antagonists to reopen philosophical questions that earlier deaths nominally closed. It's not lazy recycling. It's more like a recurring philosophical inquiry where each antagonist gets to restate the case under different conditions with different emotional stakes. Shane got to make the case as a friend, as a person Rick loved, as someone whose argument was inseparable from his humanity. That made it the most dangerous version of the argument, the one hardest to dismiss. And so it had to be removed from play before Rick was in a position to answer it definitively. Here's the implication I find most interesting, and I want to be transparent that this is my interpretation rather than something the writers confirmed. Rick never answered Shane's question. He kept encountering versions of it. through the governor, through Negan. But he never sat down with the original proposition. He never said, Shane, you were right about this and wrong about this, and here's where the line falls for me. He couldn't. Shane was dead. So Rick spent years making Shane's choices, the executions, the strategic cruelties, the protection of found family by any means available, while maintaining the emotional architecture of someone still committed to Philosophy 1. He was doing Shane's math and telling himself it was Rick's morality. And the show, to its credit, kept recording that tension even when it didn't name it. The grief Rick never processed about Shane is, I'd argue, the psychological wound the story couldn't close. It kept reopening. In the hallucinations of Laurie, in the phone calls to the dead, in the way Rick's leadership kept cycling between compassionate and brutal with no stable middle ground. Shane's absence wasn't neutral. It was a structural wound in Rick's psyche that the story carried forward, quietly, underneath everything else. And it was waiting for years for someone to come back and finally ask the question out loud. Rick Grimes never properly grieved Shane Walsh. That's the detail I keep coming back to, and I think it's one of the most telling structural choices the show made. After the field, after Carl's shot in the darks and Negan, the group dispersed and then reassembled on the road. Rick told them what happened, or a version of what happened. He was pale, shaking slightly, clearly in some kind of shock, but the grief that should have followed the death of his oldest friend, the man he'd known before the world ended, the man who had kept his family alive when Rick couldn't. That grief never got its own episode. It got absorbed into forward momentum. The farm fell the same night. New threats, new direction, new urgency. The show gave Laurie's death, later in season 3, a significant emotional aftermath. Rick's breakdown at the phone calls to the dead, the vision of Laurie in a white dress, the fragmentation of his leadership, was extended and psychologically detailed. The writers gave Rick room to fall apart over Laurie. They did not give him that room over Shane. There's a fan observation worth including here because I think it's worth considering, even though it's not something I've seen confirmed by any writer or showrunner. That the phone calls Rick makes to the dead in season 3 feel incomplete without Shane in them. We learn eventually that Rick was calling Laurie, Amy, Jackie, Jim, and Andrea. The absence of Shane from that list is either a deliberate choice or a telling omission. I can't say which, but the emotional logic of Shane being absent from Rick's grief ritual is interesting to sit with. What the show does give us in place of direct grief is guilt transformed and externalized. Rick doesn't process Shane consciously. He processes something adjacent. Every time Rick makes a decision Shane would have made, efficiently, pragmatically, without apology, he seems to become slightly more hollow around the edges. Not because he regrets the decisions, but because something about them costs him the version of himself he started as. Now, and I want to be careful here because I'm moving into theory territory, I think the clearest candidate for the show finally finishing Shane's question is The Ones Who Live, the 2024 miniseries that brought back Rick and Michonne and placed them inside the CRM. Think about what the CRM represents, philosophically. It is Shane's argument at its most developed, most powerful, most resource-intensive expression. It has taken the utilitarian survival logic, people as resources, sacrifice as operational necessity, sentiment as a liability, and built an entire military-political infrastructure around it. Rick, by the events of The Ones Who Live, has been living inside that system for years. He's been shaped by it, constrained by it, and at some level absorbed into it. That is the Walking Dead version of Shane's question finally coming due. Can Rick, having become Shane, having lived Shane's philosophy long enough to stop consciously noticing it, choose to stop? Can he choose differently? Can found family, specifically Michonne, be the variable that Shane's math never accounted for. Michonne's framing, the idea embedded in the series title, that they are the ones who live, is interesting to sit with in this context. It sounds like a statement of survival triumph, but it also sounds, read from Shane's angle, like exactly the declaration Shane was making in Season 2. We're the ones who live. We made the choices that kept us alive. We did what was necessary. The difference, and I think this is what the mini-series is ultimately exploring, is what living means. For Shane, living was biological continuation. For Michonne, living includes the people you're living for, the reasons you came back, the version of yourself you recognise in the morning. Rick in The Ones Who Live is having to choose between those two definitions in real time. Shane's question, asked in a field in Georgia in Season 2, confronted, maybe answered, maybe only partially, a decade later somewhere deep inside a CRM facility. That's a long time to carry a conversation you walked away from. The hypothetical that the show never quite lets itself explore is worth spending time on, because I think it illuminates the story's actual choices by contrast. What would have happened if Shane had lived past Season 2? I want to be clear, this is speculation, framed as theory. The show made the choice it made, but tracing the hypothetical tells us something about why that choice was structurally necessary. If Shane had survived, if Rick hadn't walked him into that field, or had walked away from the confrontation instead of into it, the show would have faced an immediate structural problem. Shane and Rick would have had to reach some kind of operational equilibrium, or one of them would have had to leave the group, or the tension between them would have escalated to a resolution the show wasn't ready to reach. There's no version of both men functioning within the same community, with the same competing philosophies and the same history between them, that doesn't collapse into continuous escalation. Some fans have argued that Shane alive would have saved the prison, that his tactical clarity and willingness to make hard calls would have prevented the governor's siege, or at least made the defence more effective. It's a compelling argument. The prison's defensive failures had real, observable weaknesses that more aggressive, Shane-style leadership might have addressed. But I think this counterpoint, while interesting, actually proves the theory's core point. Shane might have saved the prison physically. He might also have made it into something that couldn't survive Rick. Two versions of necessary survival, in conflict, with only one possible winner. What's more interesting to me is the character displacement theory, the argument that every major Walking Dead villain, after Season 2, is, in some structural sense, Shane with his humanity reconfigured. The Governor Philip Blake was something recognisable before Woodbury, and before his particular shape of madness. A man who lost people he loved, who made brutal choices to protect a community, who believed the strong had an obligation to do what the weak couldn't. His cruelty developed from that base, but the base itself is recognisable. He's Shane, with a compassion hollowed out and something darker filling the space. Gareth and the Terminus community represent another version, Shane's utilitarianism applied without the emotional tether of friendship or genuine community loyalty. Terminus is what Shane's logic looks like when it loses its face entirely. The people there had their own specific tragedy that led them to their conclusions, but their operating principle, that survival justifies any cost, that others are resources, is Shane's argument at its logical extreme. Negan is perhaps the most deliberate echo and the most interesting, because Negan is given a redemption arc that Shane never received. Negan eventually, across multiple seasons and into Dead City, becomes something closer to Philosophy 1. Protecting children, questioning his own legacy, asking whether the man he built himself into was worth what it cost. That is the journey Shane was on when he was removed. Not arrived. Not complete. On the journey. Negan gets to finish it. Shane didn't. That asymmetry feels meaningful, whether it's intentional or not. Alpha is the version of Shane's argument that has fully abandoned found family as a value. The Whisperer's philosophy, that the Walker hierarchy represents the only honest framework for the world as it now exists, is Shane's survivalism taken to its logical terminus and stripped of the one thing that made Shane's version distinctly human: love for specific people. Shane killed Otis for Carl. Alpha killed people for a principle. That's the distance between Shane and the end point his argument reaches when it loses its anchor. And here's the quiet counterpoint I want to offer before moving forward. Maybe Shane alive, tethered to Rick and Carl, and the found family around him, would never have become any of those things. Maybe the very thing that made his philosophy dangerous, the willingness to sacrifice for people he specifically loved, was also the thing that would have kept it from metastasizing into something unrecognizable. We'll never know. The show made its choice. But every villain who followed is carrying a piece of the question he left behind. And the franchise has been honest in its way about the fact that it can't answer that question either. It just keeps asking it, in new voices, with new faces, in communities that rise and fall around the same unresolved argument. The pattern Shane established, the cycle it created, didn't die with him. If anything, it became the franchise's organising principle. And watching it repeat across seasons and spin-offs, you start to see a logic to it that's both structurally elegant and quietly tragic. Here's the cycle as I understand it. A leader emerges who is right about survival and wrong about humanity, or who has resolved the tension between them in favour of survival at the cost of the people around them. That leader's methods work for a time. They keep people alive. They establish or maintain a community, and then they encounter something their philosophy can't fully account for. Usually the fragile, irrational, inefficient thing called found family, and the cycle breaks. Shane was the first version of this. Right about the farm, right about the prison's strategic requirements, functionally effective at keeping people alive, and unable to survive contact with the reality that Rick's loyalty to his family was not a weakness he could overcome by force. The found family logic defeated the survival logic. Not cleanly, not without cost, but decisively. The Governor is the second clear version. He had Woodbury, he had order, he had community. And then he had the tank, the bridge, and the final assault on the prison, the ultimate destruction of everything he'd built, in pursuit of a decisive victory over a threat his philosophy couldn't accommodate. The prison fell, but so did he. The found family inside those walls survived him, however barely. Negan's arc is the most extended version of this cycle, and the most complicated, because the show gave him room to break the pattern. Negan lost. He was defeated, imprisoned, eventually released. And his encounter with found family, specifically with Judith in the later seasons, began to change him in ways his earlier philosophy couldn't have produced. Dead City continues that transformation. Negan protecting Maggie's son. Negan questioning who he built himself into. Negan, of all characters, becoming something like the living answer to Shane's question. What does a man who chose survival over humanity do when survival's no longer the immediate crisis? He grieves, it turns out. He tries to repair things he can't repair. He carries the cost. Judith Grimes in the later seasons is where the motif fully transforms. She wears the hat. That sheriff's hat that began on Shane's head and passed through Rick and Carl. And she carries a combination of traits the show has clearly developed with intention. She has Shane's tactical clarity. She does not flinch from hard truths about survival. She's also simultaneously the keeper of her father's letters, the inheritor of values the found family forged across years of impossible circumstances. Judith is the synthesis the story has been building toward. She doesn't have to choose between Shane's philosophy and Rick's. She has, through childhood in the apocalypse, developed a version that holds both. The pragmatism is there, the love is also there. The hat on her head isn't a symbol of inherited violence anymore. It's a symbol of something that survived the violence and kept growing. That felt, watching the later seasons, like the show quietly answering something it had never named directly. Not resolving Shane's question so much as demonstrating that the next generation didn't have to be bound by it in the same way. That a child raised in the apocalypse, with full knowledge of what it costs, could make different choices from a more integrated place. Whether that's genuine narrative resolution or something more fragile is a real question. The franchise's track record on stable, lasting hope is not, to put it gently, reassuring. But Judith represents the possibility, however precarious, that the cycle Shane started could eventually break. Not through defeating his argument, but through absorbing it and choosing to carry only what's worth keeping forward. The hat doesn't forget where it's been, but it doesn't have to be defined by it either. And that's where the theory starts to feel less like a question about the past and more like a question about what comes next. Go back to that field in season 2, the one we started in. It's night. The grass is dark. Shane's supply check from earlier in the episode is already hours behind him. The careful, methodical work of someone thinking about tomorrow, about the group's needs, about keeping people alive through another day. And then the field. And then the knife. And then Carl's shot, fading into the Georgia dark. The field is empty after. That's the image I keep returning to. Not the confrontation itself, but the aftermath. The absence where two people had just been, the grass settling back into stillness, the night continuing without comment. We started with a question. Was Shane removed because he was wrong, or because he was starting to be right? Having walked through the evidence, the patterns, the decade of franchise storytelling that followed, here's where I land, offered as theory rather than certainty. I think Shane was removed because he was both, simultaneously. He was wrong about the means, about the Otis calculation, about the attempt on Rick, about the belief that survival logic could override the bonds that gave survival its meaning. And he was right about the shape of the world, about the farm's vulnerability, about the violence the prison would require, about the fact that the people Rick cared about would need to make harder choices than they were prepared to make. The tragedy of Shane Walsh, as I understand it, is that he arrived at the correct analysis with the wrong emotional toolkit. He couldn't hold his survivalism and his love for Rick and his grief about Laurie in the same frame without one of them fracturing everything else. His philosophy required him to treat people as resources, and the specific people he loved most could not survive being treated that way. The argument ate itself from the inside. Rick, in the decade after Shane's death, managed the same tension better. But only by refusing to name it. By doing Shane's math without calling it that. By maintaining the mythology of his own moral framework even as the choices inside it started to look increasingly familiar. The Ones Who Live, Rick's story inside the CRM, is where the name finally threatens to be said out loud. The CRM is Shane's world. It runs on Shane's logic, scale to institutional power, with all the human inconveniences of friendship and loyalty and mercy systematically managed out. Rick has been living inside that world for years. And Michonne came back for him, across the entire world, across years of separation. Not because the math worked out, but because the math was never the point. That's the counter-argument Shane never had available to him. Not someone telling him his philosophy was wrong. Someone demonstrating, through the unreasonable act of love, that there's a category of choice his philosophy couldn't account for. Michonne Walking back into that facility isn't a survival calculation. It's a refutation of the premise. Shane wanted someone to do that for him. Laurie couldn't. Not in the end. Rick couldn't. Not by season 2. Carl was a child. There wasn't someone in Shane's orbit who could hold the counterexample close enough and long enough to shift him. Maybe, in a different story, there could have been. Some fans believe Shane's arc was always going to end in that field, that the character was structurally predetermined to die there by the logic of the source material and the show's thematic architecture. Others believe Shane was a character whose story could have gone somewhere genuinely different, given different narrative conditions. Both feel true to me, in different ways, and I don't think I need to choose between them to appreciate what his removal meant for everything that followed. The franchise never stopped asking his question. That's the most honest testament to what he was. Back in that field now, in the quiet after. Same grass, same dark sky. The spot where Rick and Shane stood is just grass again, indistinguishable from the rest. But here's the thing about that supply check from the beginning of the episode. Shane was preparing for tomorrow. For the group's tomorrow. Methodical, careful, quietly efficient. The supplies got used. The group survived the day. Was he wrong? Or was he just unable to survive being right? I'm not sure the show ever fully answered that. And maybe that's exactly why, all these years later, we're still standing in this field.